Sorry. I said at the end of the last class, do you remember Amos, after he expels those foreign rulers, the Hyksos, he expels them from control of northern Egypt in 1560 BC, and he enslaves the Israelites. Well, after that, the Egyptians, they constructed a store city there. When it was Avaris, when the Hyksos controlled it. When the Egyptians kicked them out, they called it Perunefer. They have the Israelite slaves build a store city, and also they build at that time their own royal stronghold. They want a military complex, something there in the Nile Delta, especially after what has happened. And they have the store city, and they're building this palace complex and this royal citadel there. And at the time of Moses and Amenhotep, so now we're in the middle of the 15th century. Remember, the Exodus is 1446. So at the time of Moses and Amenhotep, this palace complex that is here at Perunefer, which is the archaeological site Tel El Daba, it has 3 palaces, a number of associated buildings, and it has a perimeter wall around it, and that area is about 13.6 acres. It's a significant complex, and you have the other areas around it. And this is one of the palaces. I gave you a close-up of the site there last week. But one of those palaces is probably, I would say almost certainly, where Aaron and Moses confronted Amenhotep and demanded that he free the Israelite slaves. And so this city, it's you see it's on the easternmost tributary of the Nile, right there on the water, and it served as a major naval stronghold, a military base during Thutmose III, who's the immediate predecessor of Amenhotep II. I'm suggesting to you, Amenhotep II is the pharaoh of the Exodus. Thutmose III is his immediate predecessor, and this functions as a naval stronghold certainly with Thutmose and Amenhotep. They use it as a launching pad for their campaigns into the Levant. Now, very interestingly, this strategic Egyptian military center in the eastern delta was suddenly and mysteriously abandoned. And there's nothing in recorded Egyptian history that explains that abandonment. The excavators, Manfred Betak and his successor, Irene Forstner-Mueller, they say the palace district was probably abandoned. I highlight probably just so you know they got some wiggle room there, because Petrovich is going to say au contraire. But he says the palace district was probably abandoned after the reign of Amenophis II. That's just another name for Amenhotep. Okay, so they're saying probably after Amenhotep's reign. The reason for the abandonment of this district, and presumably the entire city adjoining the district on the south, is an unsolved puzzle at this time. Its solution would be of the greatest importance to historians. And the suddenness of the abandonment, it's indicated by the fact that in these weapons workshops, which were part of this military complex, in those workshops, there are scores of Aegean arrowheads and the pumice that was used for polishing them just scattered around. It was not like people, hey, yeah, we're going to move, let's box up and let's take No, you just have scores of these things around there. And the abandonment is all the more intriguing in light of Douglas Petrovich's arguments, which he published. And when I put the paper online, you can go see his paper and all his arguments for this. But in light of his arguments that the abandonment of this site took place during the reign of Amenhotep II, not after. Like they're saying, probably after. He says, no, it was during the reign. Much better case for that. Here's what Petrovich says. He says, once the native Egyptians eradicated the foreign invaders, the Hyksos, who had dominated their landscape for over a century, they quickly moved to rebuild the destroyed city of Avaris, which they named Perunefer, and establish it as a storehouse eventually to be utilized as a military garrison with weapon-making facilities. Peru-Nefer/Avaris became the most vital cog in the unprecedented military campaigning under the reigns of Thutmose III and Amenhotep II. So this was a serious military complex from which they launched these military campaigns into the Levant. He says, yet during the height of Egypt's enterprise and glory, when Egypt was bossing it, he says, her naval base was abandoned mysteriously and her imperialistic machinery ground to a halt. Egypt suddenly sought to make treaties rather than seize whatever she desired. Neither the site nor Egyptian annals provides an explicit answer as to why Avaris/Peru-Nefer was abandoned. Even years of excavation at the site have not answered this vital question. As Bitak himself states, the reasons for this are very unclear. The available evidence indicates that the vacating of the site is understood best to have occurred during the reign of Amenhotep II, rather than at the end of his reign or during the reign of Thutmose IV, who's Amenhotep II's successor. So he's arguing, he says, look, this happens during the reign here. And Petrovich, he suggests that the site was suddenly and mysteriously abandoned because Egypt's army was decimated in the Exodus. That's what he thinks is the best answer. He says, the devastating loss of the Egyptian army during their failure to retrieve the Israelites explains the abandonment of Avaris perfectly. The elimination of the army clearly headquartered at Avaris would turn the entire city into a ghost town. So that he's an Egyptologist, archaeologist, very familiar with the timing in these things, and that's his take on it. Now, Petrovich, he calculates, we know from the Bible the Exodus is in 1446 BC. His calculation, that is the 7th year of Amenhotep II. And he mentioned this odd change in their imperialism, this odd change in Egypt's political and military direction. It was the sudden curtailment of their aggression and imperialism at the height of their power. Right at this time, what is going on? Not only we have this abandonment, but we have a change in the political and military direction of the nation. Something is going on. Amenhotep II's predecessor, Thutmose III, he was a renowned conqueror. He led 17 military campaigns into the Levant and beyond, into Mesopotamia. 17 of those campaigns. Amenhotep II, he led only 2. And the second, the last of which was a rare November campaign. They didn't typically start campaigns in November. But his second and last campaign was a rare November incursion into southern Canaan, and he did it some 6 months after the Exodus. Because Petrovich has that his second campaign is year 7 of his reign. By Petrovich's calculation, that is 1446. He does it in November of 1446, and the Exodus is in the spring. Or Exodus is earlier in the year of 1446. So this is Amenhotep II, he goes in November after the Exodus, and the timing suggests that this campaign was in response to some kind of emergency. Okay, why go in November? It seems like something's up that he's doing it. And then the strangeness of that second and final campaign of Amenhotep II, it's further reflected in the fact that his second camp, typically the way successive military campaigns went, was you would go further out with each successive campaign. That's not what happened with Amenhotep. His first campaign in year 3, 4 years earlier, he went further out. In his second campaign in year 7, he stayed closer to Egypt. So that's another weird thing about it. Not only is it in November, he stays closer to Egypt. And another odd thing is that he seemed to focus on gathering and getting slaves and weapons, chariots. And the way we know that is we have what is called his booty list. Okay, so this is the spoils that are brought back. We have his booty list from both of his campaigns. And his booty list for his second campaign includes 101,128 prisoners, 1,082 chariots, 13,500 weapons. And we have his booty list from his first campaign. And you say, well, 101,000 prisoners of war kind of thing. What if he's exaggerating? Well, what if he is? We have his first booty list, and his second campaign, that number, it's 46 times greater. The number of prisoners of war, he says, he brought back. And that certainly seems like there's a need to replenish a recently lost slave force. So here he goes in November. He stays closer to Egypt than his prior campaign, and he's focused on getting all of these prisoners of war. And so you start to say, well, that certainly looks like that's in response to what happened in the Exodus and regarding the reversal of foreign policy that we see with Egypt. Petrovich says, another oddity of A2, that's his reference to Amenhotep's second military campaign into the Levant. He says another oddity of A2 is that after its conclusion, the Egyptian army, established by Thutmose III as the 15th century BC's most elite fighting force. So Thutmose III is the one who took 17 military campaigns all the way into Mesopotamia. He says another oddity is that after its conclusion, the Egyptian army went into virtual hibernation. Their previous policy of unwavering aggressiveness toward Mitanni, that was another superpower centered in Mesopotamia, superpower of the day. It says their previous policy of unwavering aggressiveness toward Mitanni became one of passivity and the signing of peace treaties. The reason for this new policy is missing from the historical record, but Amenhotep II evidently was the pharaoh who first signed a treaty with Mitanni subsequent to his second campaign. Why would Amenhotep II do the unthinkable and opt to make a treaty with Mitanni? This mysterious reversal in foreign policy would remain unexplainable and unthinkable if not for the possibility of a single cataclysmic event. If the Egyptians lost virtually their entire army in the springtime disaster at the Red Sea in year 7, a desperate reconnaissance campaign designed to save face with the rest of the ancient world and to replenish their Israelite slave base would be paramount. Certainly, the Egyptians would have needed time to rally their remaining forces together, however small and or in shambles their army may have been, and it would explain a November campaign that was nothing more than a slave raid into Palestine as a show of force. The Egyptians could not afford to live through the winter without the production that was provided by the Hebrew workforce, and they could not allow Mitanni or any other ancient power to consider using the winter to plan an attack on Egyptian territories which would seem vulnerable. And so you have these little pieces of information. And in addition, that booty list from Amenhotep II's second campaign, it refers to other foreign rulers having heard of his great success in that campaign. Now, Petrovich points out, he says, this reference to the effect of a military campaign upon kings of distant nations, all of whom ruled empires in their own right, is unique among contemporary Egyptian booty lists and annals. So here again, you have something odd, out of place. He's very interested in this concern over how other kings viewed his year 7 conquest may be the result of his needing a victorious campaign after the Exodus to ward off suspicion that Egypt was no longer able to wage war. So he sees the vulnerability and okay, all right, look at us. You see what we're doing? Don't get any ideas. were still bad. Okay, these things just fit together. Now, another intriguing bit of evidence that supports this claim that Amenhotep is the Pharaoh of the Exodus is the subsequent desecration of Hatshepsut's image. You remember Hatshepsut, she is the daughter of Pharaoh, I suggest to you, who took Moses, raised him as her stepson. Now, at some point after her death, a concerted effort was made to remove her from Egyptian history. Okay, there was a plan. This was deliberate. They're trying to take her memory out of Egyptian history. Petrovich comments on that, and he says, many inscribed cartouches, that's an oval with the royal name in it, okay, of her were erased, while her busts were smashed or broken into pieces, perhaps by gangs of workmen dispatched to various sites throughout Egypt. In some cases, the culprits carefully and completely hacked out the silhouette of her image from carvings, often leaving a distinct Hatshepsut, that's a mouthful, Hatshepsut-shaped lacuna in the middle of a scene, often as a preliminary step to replacing it with a different image or royal cartouche, usually that of Thutmose I or II. At Karnak, her obelisks, these are pillars that are inscribed, were walled up and incorporated into the vestibule in front of Pylon 5, while at Jezero, her statues and sphinxes were removed, smashed, and cast into trash dumps. Now, so this is known, that there was a campaign to expunge her from Egyptian history, to make her like she never existed. And though many Egyptologists, they believe that campaign to expunge her from Egyptian history was waged by Thutmose III out of a sense of sexist shame for having shared the throne with her. You remember, he came to the throne as an infant or a small child, was unable to rule in that capacity, so she was the de facto pharaoh and then took on that role. And so they had a co-regency. So the idea is that, well, he went and got chapped because he had to share the throne with a woman. And so that's what drove that. But there are problems with that. It's inconsistent with how he had treated her memory elsewhere. Right? We have indications that he's not chapped about her. And we have that. And besides, the earliest that this could have started was 20 years after she was off the scene. Okay, so she's gone in 1483. He reigns till 1450. Why wait at least 20 years to do this? It just doesn't make a lot of sense that is the motivation. And also, why would Senenmut, who was her chief advisor, why would he also be targeted? He was a man. But he was caught up in this attempt to expunge her from history. I think a much better candidate for who's doing this is Amenhotep II. I think he's a better candidate. Look, if Hatshepsut had raised Moses as her own son, that's why he was there. She had rescued him, raised him as her own son. Well, then the humiliating and the devastating defeat that they suffered at the Red Sea would have left Amenhotep seething with rage against her. She was the one who caused all of this. And that kind of rage would explain wanting to extinguish her existence from the afterlife. It was thought that if you could remove a person from the society's memory, that you would extinguish them in the afterlife. And so that's an awful lot of rage. And that fits, in my judgment, quite well with Amenhotep II, the Pharaoh of the Exodus. Now, when we talk about going from Egypt and to the Promised Land, the Exodus proper and the wilderness wandering, I want to alert you, like I did before, to kind of set your expectations about the unlikelihood of finding physical remains of the wandering. Okay, what are we going to expect with this group of people wandering in the desert? Are we going to find archaeological evidence of that? Is that reasonable to expect that? Well, the people of Israel, they were nomadic. Okay, they're nomadic and they lived in tents during the Exodus. that in the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, you see that in a number of places, they would have had minimal belongings. For the most part, they used skins rather than ceramic vessels to transport liquids. So the skins aren't going to be there. Archaeologist James Hoffmeyer, he says, one would not expect nomadic peoples who only occupy a particular spot for a short period of time to leave tangible evidence of their presence. And that's right, you see. For example, just to show you how that works, we know from Egyptian annals, and we know from a stela, which is just an upright stone slab with markings on it. So we know from Egyptian annals and from a stela that the pre-Exodus Pharaoh, Thutmose III, that he laid siege to the city of Megiddo for 7 months. Okay, so we know that that's something that happened. And Hoffmeyer comments and he says, even given the prolonged period of the Egyptian siege at Megiddo, with thousands of soldiers and hundreds of horses from the chariots present, no archaeological evidence of this camp has been discovered, despite a century of excavations and explorations at Megiddo. So it just makes the point, see, of what's a reasonable expectation for this kind of brief stay, 7 months there at Megiddo or whatever you're talking about. How realistic is it to think you're going to find archaeological remains? And it's not realistic. As Hoffmeyer concludes, he says, so it's not surprising that no clear archaeological evidence for Israelites in Sinai has been found. To expect otherwise is unrealistic. And so people say, well, I demand that you have that. I say, well, is it reasonable to think you're going to find such a thing? You see, that's what I want to know about. Now, related to this is kind of a footnote. How reasonable is it to expect to find archaeological remains of the wandering? There are a number of scholars who claim that Moses' statements about the size of the Israelite population during the Exodus, that they have been misunderstood to mean that Israel was far larger than Moses intended to communicate. In other words, the idea is that, look, it wasn't 600,000 men and women and children putting it at 2 million or whatever, because we have misunderstood. Now, there are people that make this argument, and it's generally made along two kind of tracks. One deals with the word that's translated thousand, eleph. And they say, well, look, you've misunderstood eleph. That word can mean clan or military unit, a unit that is less than 1,000. Yes, it means 1,000, but it also has other meanings. And if those meanings are intended, well, then that shrinks it down to less than 600. If you mean 600 clans, you see that's different. If the clans are less than 1,000, that's going to be different than 600,000. So that's one track that people argue along. The other track people argue along and say, look, there was some kind of understood convention of exaggeration when describing the victories of a great king in the ancient Near East. In other words, Moses, they would say, yes, no, it does mean 600,000 men and women and children. He is saying those numbers, but he was saying them in a context where he understood that there was a convention of hyperbole. That when you spoke about the works of a great king or a god, that you would inflate those to his glory. And so for an apples to apples things, Moses would speak so he wouldn't be misunderstood. Okay? Now, I have to tell you that each of those proposed theories that go along those two tracks has difficulties. Okay? They have difficulties. None of them have gained general acceptance, or I would say even wide acceptance. But I want you to be aware of them, because if it's true that the people group Israel wandering is smaller, well, then it's even less likely you're going to find something. Here are some of those scholars I'm talking about who make these claims that the texts have been misunderstood, that we give, we're saying, misunderstanding Moses to be saying the group's greater than Moses intended us to understand. John Wenham in 67, an article in Tyndale Bulletin. David Fouts, I think he did his doctoral dissertation on that, and he's published in these 3 different venues. James Hoffmeyer in his book, Ancient Israel and Sinai, and Ronald Allen in his 2012 commentary on Numbers. Those are the people I know of. Okay, there may be others, but I say that's just a footnote. Okay, back. Now, around 1400, okay, Exodus 1446, 40 years of wilderness wandering. 1406, we start with the conquest. Okay, somewhere around 1400, Pharaoh Amenhotep III, he built a temple in Soleb, which is in the current nation of Sudan. And that temple was dedicated to the god Amun-Re. And there on a pillar there in that temple, there was inscribed a topographical list, a list of places. And one of those in the temple refers to the land of the Shasu of Yahweh. The land of the Shasu of Yahweh. And as Charles Alling, who's an Egyptologist, and Clyde Billington, who's a retired professor of ancient history and focused a lot on Egypt, as they say, the term Shasu is almost exclusively used in New Kingdom, that's the time of Egypt, the time we're talking about, in New Kingdom texts for semi-nomadic peoples living in parts of Lebanon, Syria, Sinai, Canaan, and Transjordan. You see, that's who they are. So here is an Egyptian reference, some 50 years after the Exodus, to semi-nomadic people who are associated with the Levant and who were devoted to Yahweh, the God of the Israelites. Now that's pretty interesting. I mean, that certainly suggests Egyptian familiarity with Israel and its God. From a very early date, a familiarity that's consistent with the events of the Exodus. They know who Yahweh is. How do they know? Because Moses told them. Right? Yahweh says, let my people go. And so that's consistent with that. Right? Here's how Alling and Billington, they conclude. They say, although we do not have all the information that we wish we did, it is significant that there are no mentions of the Shasu of Yahweh in Egyptian texts earlier than the reign of Amenhotep III. If the group in question were Yahweh followers who never went to Egypt, why are they absent in topographical lists from the early period of the 18th dynasty? For example, from the extensive topographical list of Thutmose III. The reason may very well be because the Shasu of Yahweh were indeed the Israelites, and that they were still living in Egypt in the early 18th dynasty. It thus appears very likely that the Shasu of Yahweh, who are mentioned in the topographical texts at Soleb and Amara West, were the Israelites who by about 1400 BC had settled into their own land in the mountains of Canaan. It also appears that for the ancient Egyptians, the one feature that distinguished the Israelites from all the other Shasu, Semitic herders in this area, was their worship of the God Yahweh. All right, so we're talking about what do we have about the wandering period, the actual movement from Egypt to the Promised Land? Well, that's something of note. And it also seems likely that the actual name Israel, it seems likely that that name was used in an Egyptian inscription that's known as the Berlin Statue Pedestal Relief 21687. That item, it was acquired in 1913 by Ludwig Borchert. He bought it from a merchant, a man named M. Nachman. It's currently in the Egyptian Museum in Berlin. And as archaeologist Scott Stripling says of it, he says, 3 name rings appear on a statue pedestal relief 21687. From left to right in English, they read as follows: Ashkelon, Canaan, and Israel. Unfortunately, because the granite slab broke, the final third of the Israel name ring is missing on the right edge of the relief. So you have that that going on. Now, in 2001, a German archaeologist, a scholar named Manfred Gorg, he published a new reading of the damaged part. And he contended that it was an archaic form of the name Israel. And so he goes and does his work and publishes this and says, no, this is what this is saying. This is an ancient way of saying Israel. And he was opposed in that disputed by archaeologist James Hoffmeyer. But then 9 years later, Gorg was joined by two other scholars, Peter van der Veen from the University of Mainz and Christopher Thays from the University of Heidelberg. And they published a scholarly defense of Gorg's original argument, and they provided additional supporting evidence for that argument. And then in 2017 paper, Wolfgang Zwickel and Peter van der Veen, they said in a journal article, they said that, quote, an increasing number of scholars now tend to accept this reading. So Gorg's getting traction, that is in fact saying that that's ancient Israel. And this inscription, the inscription itself, dates to the reign of Ramesses II. So we're in the 13th century, the 1200s. That's when the inscription was done. But because of the spellings, how the names are presented, it is believed that it was copied from an earlier inscription. So that inscription itself was done in the 13th century. But because of the form of it, they say, well, it was a copy. They copied from an earlier inscription that was done around 1400. So 1400, Scott Stripling, the archaeologist Stripling, says, the names and their proximity to one another is significant because of a similar arrangement on the Merenptah stela, which I'll talk about later, which also mentions Israel. If Gorg's reading withstands scrutiny, then the Berlin pedestal provides strong evidence for Israel in Canaan in the 18th dynasty, likely in the 14th century. So they go in at 1406, 14th century begins 1400. So there they are, Egyptian inscription, likely there in the 4th century, using the very name Israel. And I find that very interesting. Now, during their time of wandering in the wilderness, you'll recall that the Israelites defeated two kings on the eastern side of the Jordan, Sihon and Og. That's in Numbers chapter 21. And as a result of the victory that the Lord gave them over those two kings, they then controlled a tract of land on the east side of the Jordan that's about 150 miles long. So you can see here, this is the territory they got from Sihon, and this is what they got from Og. So this is a big chunk of land. And you notice that the nation right to the south, they conquer Sihon and Og, but the nation right to the south of them is Moab. And so Moab's nervous. And Balak, the king of Moab, he's there, and he's the king of this land that's now controlled by Israel. He seeks to hire Balaam, the son of Beor. Right? Scripture. He's hiring Balaam, the son of Beor, to put a curse on Israel. You see that in Numbers 22, verses 1 to 7. Now, Balaam, he was either unwilling or unable to speak falsely in God's name. And he wound up blessing Israel rather than cursing Israel. But he succumbed to the temptation to harm Israel by advising the Moabites to use their women to pull the Israelites into idolatry, specifically the idolatry that occurred at Baal Peor. And so, but here we have Balaam, son of Beor, that the king of Moab is going to curse Israel. Now, in 1967, an inscription on a plaster wall dating from the 9th century BC, so in the 800s BC, this inscription, it was discovered at Deir Allah in Jordan, which is probably the site of ancient Succoth. Succoth in Israel, not the one in Egypt. Okay, it was a poetic text. It's written in Aramaic, and it told a story. So it's Aramaic, poetic text. It tells a story. It's in the 9th century BC, but it's telling a story from centuries earlier. All right? And so it's this text that tells that older story, and this plaster was pieced back together from over 100 fragments. So you puzzle people, Pate, you puzzle people here. You see, put all these pieces, and you see how it fits. But here it is. And here's what the archaeologist Titus Kennedy says about this Balaam inscription. He says, the story relates how a man named Balaam, son of Beor, right? I mean, the scriptures, Balaam, son of Beor, that's what we're going to get. Well, here you have this. Balaam, son of Beor, described as a seer or prophet, received a divine message at night from the gods, and specifically from the god El, that darkness and chaos would be coming on the land due to the work of hostile divinities. In this narrative, Balaam went through various religious rituals in an attempt to appease the gods. This section is followed by mention of the underworld. Then the people apparently rejected, condemned, and banned Balaam and his message, but the text is unclear because of its fragmentary condition. However, the careful and artistic composition of this text on the wall of a building indicates the importance of the story of Balaam the seer. The existence of the Balaam inscription demonstrates that in ancient times, Balaam, son of Beor, was known as a famous seer in the area on the east side of the Jordan River where the events recorded in the book of Numbers took place. Again, isn't this just an amazing coincidence? You know, the Bible's saying this is what do you know? Here's references to Balaam, son of Beor, who's in this game. That's how he's looked at and how he's viewed. He's in that. So that's something. Now, to me, the sum of the matter, we're looking at Israel, we're looking at the sojourn in Egypt, we're looking at the Exodus. You often hear people say, well, there's absolutely nothing about that. That's why the Bible's false. I hope I've done enough to let you see that's not right. You see, that's not right. And as I consider the sum of the matter is that those who reject the historicity of Scripture's account of Israel, Egypt, and the Exodus, they are being unreasonably skeptical. Okay, they're being unreasonably skeptical. They're demanding a kind or a quantum of evidence that is unrealistic given the limitations of archaeological investigation into ancient Egypt. You see, they set the bar so high. You say, no, well, it's not definitive. I got to have something here. I need blood type. I need a document written. Well, you're not going to get it. Right? But they set that up. So when you lower those defenses, you see, I think one's eyes are open then to Scripture's consistency with the historical data. Right? Then you can appreciate the fact that there was a significant population from the land of Jacob's family in the precise area described in Scripture at the precise time described in Scripture. Right where they said they were. You have that. And you can see that Pithom and Ramesses, they were indeed storage cities, just as the Bible said they were. And you can see the meshing of many details with the chronology, the Egyptian chronology with many biblical details. They just fit right together. And you can see the significant circumstantial evidence that's pointing to a significant transformative event during the reign of Amenhotep II, where they abandoned Perunefer and all of this kind of thing, and they changed their political and military strategy. They have these strange raids going on. All right, well, then you're open to start to piece some of these things together and to see that. You know, it seems to me that until the Lord returns, there's always going to be room and the ability for a person to defend his unbelief. That seems to me to be how this thing is set up. That if you're bent on unbelief and you want to set the requirements so high, well, you can always rationalize that. Absolute certainty. You know, historical inquiry is not math. You see, absolute certainty is beyond historical inquiry. But there likewise is room for an intellectually satisfying faith. You see, intellectually satisfying faith. as evidence from ancient Egypt demonstrates. But we're just getting started. Okay? We just came out. All right, we got a long way to go, and we got tons of stuff. And we're carrying on. Now, I did hear that bell, but I still have 3 minutes, so I'm talking. Okay. Now I want to look at the conquest. Okay, so this is Israel in Egypt and the Exodus, the wandering. Now we're going to look at the conquest from 1406 and Judges. So from 1406, the conquest, down to 1051, which is when the Judges ends with Saul's kingship. Now, according to Scripture, in the spring of 1406 BC, when the Israelites were still camped there east of the Jordan River, across from the fortified city of Jericho, Joshua sent 2 spies to Jericho. And they were hidden from the king's men by the prostitute Rahab, whose house, we're told, was built into the city wall. And she sent the spies on their way, and the spies promised that they would spare her family. They wanted her to put that cord out. But you see that in Joshua chapter 2, verses 1 to 22. The Israelites, they then crossed the Jordan through a miracle of God. And in Joshua 6, they conquered the city of Jericho through another miracle. Specifically, after marching around the city of Jericho once a day for 6 days, and then 7 times on the 7th day, the priest gave a long blast on the trumpet. All the people shouted, and the city wall, the text says, fell beneath it or beneath itself. That's the literal rendering of Joshua 6:5 and 6:20. For example, the English Standard Version note says Hebrew, under itself. New English translation, Hebrew, fall in its place. That's why some translations simply say collapse. All right, there's a reason I'm telling you this. Okay? Now the Israelites then, we read that they what? They went up into the city. Okay? So the wall, it falls beneath itself. They go up into the city, destroyed it and burned it. And with the exception of Achan, we're told they did not plunder the city. They didn't take all of its stuff, take any of the devoted things for themselves. Though the silver, the gold, and the vessels of bronze and iron were put into the treasury of the house of the Lord. Now here is the tell. This is an older picture. It's now been more commercialized. But here's an older picture of Jericho, which is Tel Es Sultan. So this is from the north looking south. And you see all those gouges in there. That's because people have been excavating. But this is the city of everybody knows. No debate about it. This is Jericho. And ancient, so it's this ancient archaeological site known as Tel Es Sultan. Now it's been excavated a number of times from the early 20th century. And we have the German team first, was led by Ernst Sellen and Karl Watzinger. They worked there from 1907 to 1909. And next week, Lord willing, we'll hear about the rest of it. Thanks.